The crash itself was survivable. Almost everyone should have walked away. Then the bus caught fire, and there was only one way out. Kentucky, May 14th, 1988, 10:55 in the evening. John Pierman, 43, a part-time associate pastor and a local court clerk, had his hands on the wheel of a bus he had driven for years. On short trips around Radcliffe. Sunday routes, youth outings, nothing longer than an afternoon. Taunt was longer. 6 passengers behind him, mostly teenagers from the church youth group, riding home on Interstate 71 after a full day at Kings Island Amusement Park in Ohio. The bus was a 1977 Ford B700, a former school bus converted to church use, carrying exactly the number of people it was rated to carry. Pierman had made this kind of drive before. He had never made this specific one, 60-plus miles of interstate, at night, with a bus this full. He was not speeding. He was not driving carelessly. Investigators would later find nothing wrong with how he was operating the vehicle in the minutes before impact. What he could not see, on a curved stretch of Hogway F miles south of Carrollton, was a pickup truck traveling north in the southbound lanes, directly toward Palm, NHS owned lane, at Hogway speed. He had perhaps a second and a half to react. What Pierman did in that second and a half, and what the specific design of the vehicle he was driving did to everyone bent him in the 4 minutes that followed. As a documented case study in how a single mechanical Dexon, made years earlier by people who never met a single passenger on that bus, can determine who loves and who does not. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of American school bus culture from 1930 to 1980. What the bus was, how it worked, and what the people inside it knew that no regulation ever captured. Not nostalgia for yellow buses. The documented operational and human reality of a system that carried an entire generation to school. You have likely never thought about where the fuel tank sits on a school bus. And the reason you've never had to do that, after this night, a federal investigation made sure it sat somewhere else. And if you rode a church or activity bus in the 1970s or 80s, put it in the comments. Do you remember how many doors it had, and whether anyone ever pointed out where the emergency exit was? A future video on this channel will trace the 1939 National School Bus Standards Conference, the meeting that first tried to make school bus mean the same thing in every state, decades before Carrollton forced the next round of that same argument. Back on the bus, the vehicle John Pierman was driving that night was a 1977 Ford B700 chassis, fitted with an activity bus body in the style used widely by manufacturers like Superior Coach. Through the 1970s, it had begun its life as a standard school bus and had been transferred to the First Assembly of God Church of Radcliffe for youth transportation, a common, legal, and unremarkable arrangement Kentucky and across the country. In 1988, the bus was 11 years old. It had passed its most recent inspection. 2 new tires had been installed the week before the trip. Its front suspension and steering had been examined at the same time by a church member with mechanical experience. Every account from investigators afterward agreed on one point. Mechanically, the bus was in good condition on the night of May 14th. But good condition and safely designed were not the same question, and the difference between them is the entire subject of this video. Federal structural standards for school buses had been substantially strengthened in 1977. The same year this bus was built, meaning it fell just at the edge of the older design generation. Its fuel tank, a 60-gallon steel tank, sat outside the main chassis frame rail, unshielded, mounted low near the front right wheel well. That single placement decision, routine, industry standard, and completely legal for a bus of this age, was about to matter more than anything else on the vehicle. At 10:55 p.m., on a curved section of Interstate 71 about 5 miles south of Carrollton, a 1987 Toyota Hilux pickup truck came around the bend traveling north in the southbound lanes, directly at highway speed, directly into the path of the bus. Its driver, 34-year-old Larry Wayne Mahoney, was later found to have a blood alcohol level roughly 3 times the legal limit. He had gotten onto the interstate going the wrong direction and had already been driving against traffic for several miles. Before the two vehicles met, John Pierman had, by the NTSB's later reconstruction, no more than a second and a half between the moment the oncoming headlights became a recognizable threat and the moment of impact. He steered left, away from the direct LN of the truck. It was the response any trained driver would have made, pulling toward the open lane, away from the obstacle. The two vehicles struck at an angle rather than dead center. The right front of the pickup hit the right front of the bus. The collision itself, investigators would later state plainly, was one that everyone aboard the bus should have survived. No one inside the bus was seriously injured by the impact of the crash itself. The bus's frame held. The seats held. The passengers, thrown forward but restrained by seatbacks in the tightly packed rows, absorbed a violent but survivable jolt. What the angled impact did instead was driving the right front suspension of the bus backward and upward through the stepwell floor near the front door, directly into the unshielded fuel tank mounted just behind that wheel. The tank split open. The bus had been refueled roughly an hour earlier, so it was carrying close to a full 60 gallons of gasoline. It ignited almost immediately. The next question is not why the fire happened. Investigators would answer that clearly and specifically. The next question is what a bus carrying 67 people had, at that moment, to get them out. A bus built to the standards of the mid-1970s had 2 ways out. A front passenger door, operated by a lever near the driver's seat, and a single rear emergency door. No side door. No roof hatches. No emergency windows of the kind found on later buses and on commercial coaches of the same era. This was not a defect spec FC to TX bus. It was the ordinary configuration for a school-style bus body of TS Generaton, and met every applicable federal and state standard enforce at the time it was manufactured. The front door was destroyed in the same impact that ruptured the fuel tank, jammed shut by collision damage before the fire had even fully taken hold. That left one exit for 67 people. The rear emergency door reached through a center aisle roughly 12 inches wide, running between 11 rows of bench seating. Investigators later reconstructed what that aisle looked like. Aiders later reconstructed what that aisle actually held that night. A beverage cooler, brought along for the day trip, had been placed in the aisle near the 10th row. Bags, souvenirs, and belongings from a full day at an amusement park were scattered along the same narrow path. More than 60 people, many of them teenagers larger than the aisle, had been destined to move quickly, tread to reach that single rear door at once. Driver John Pierman, after steering to avoid the direct impact, attempted to fight the fire directly, using a small onboard fire extinguisher in the seconds after it started, before turning to help move passengers toward the rear exit. The extinguisher, standard equipment sized for a small vehicle fire, was never going to be adequate against 60 gallons of burning gasoline. Passers-by who had stopped on the interstate, along with some of Interstate, along with some of the passengers who had already escaped, worked from outside to pull immobilized children through the rear door opening, lower them roughly 3 feet to the ground. The fire reached an estimated 2,000 degrees inside the cabin within minutes. The investigation would later be exact about the timeline. From impact to the bus being fully engulfed took a matter of minutes, not the length of time it would have taken 67 people to move single file through a 12-inch aisle to one door. 27 people died that night, the driver, John Pierman, and 26 passengers, most of them teenagers who had survived the collision itself, and did not survive the collision itself, and did not survive the fire. 34 others were injured, some critically. It remains the deadliest drunk driving crash in United States history. The National Transportation Safety Board's investigation, published the following year as Highway Accident Report HAR-89/01, was direct about where responsibility began. The probable cause of the collision was the alcohol-impaired condition of the pickup truck driver, operating his vehicle against the flow of traffic on an interstate highway. Larry Wayne Mahoney was later convicted on multiple counts, including manslaughter, and served a portion of a 16-year sentence. But the NTSB's report did not stop at the collision. It went further than most crash investigations of its time were structured to go, examining not just who caused the impact, but what the vehicle itself had done once the impact occurred. The finding that reshaped bus safety policy nationwide was this: the collision was survivable. The fatalities were caused by the fire and the inadequacy of the emergency egress, the exposed fuel tank, the flammable interior materials common to buses of this era, and an exit configuration that could not move 67 people past a free in the available time. Every one of those design elements was, at the moment of manufacture, legal. That Fendraw a bus bolt entirely within the rules could still produce this outcome is the reason this case occupies a specific place in the history of American public transport. It was not a story about someone breaking a rule on the bus side. It was a story about what the rules themselves had never required. The community response began almost immediately, and it moved in two directions at once, toward drunk driving law and toward bus safety regulation. Within 6 days of the crash, Kentucky's governor at the time, Wallace Wilkinson, announced stricter statewide enforcement of drunk driving laws, increased inspections by the state's alcohol control agency, and more sobriety checkpoints. 5 years later, the state enacted still stricter drunk driving legislation. Families of the victims became involved directly, some through Mothers Against Drunkeckley, some through Mothers Against Drunk Driving chapters in Kentucky, speaking to school groups and at health fairs for years afterward, turning a pervert loss into a specific, ongoing form of public advocacy. The second direction was mechanical and regulatory, and it moved through the National Transportation Safety Board's formal recommendation process. State by state, the NTSB pressed for the phase-out of pre-1977 buses still in service, and for stronger fuel system and exit standards going forward. The response was uneven. Some states acted quickly, others did not respond to NTSB correspondence at all in the years immediately following. But the trend line was clear. In 1988, roughly 22% of the buses operating nationally were still built to the older, pre-1977 standard. Within a decade, that figure had fallen below 3%. Kentucky itself moved further and faster than the federal government required. the state adopted a school bus exit and fuel system standard that became, for a period, the strictest in the country, a specific response to a specific finding written by people who had read the same NTSB report that named the flaws in the bus their own children had ridden. Here is the specific finding that gives this case its lasting weight in the history of American pupil transportation. Investigators found that the bus met every federal standard in force at the time it was manufactured. Not a corner cut, not a maintenance failure, not an owner ignoring a known defect. A legally built, properly maintained, correctly inspected vehicle. And 27 people still died because the standards themselves had never required a shielded fuel tank, flame-resistant interior materials, or more than one practical way out. Before you can understand why that gap existed, you need to understand what school bus regulating looked like before 1977. Structural standards had developed piecemeal, state by state and decade by decade, since the first National School Bus Standards Conference in 1939, a meeting convened by the National School Bus Association and the National Safety Councilorants in 1939. A meeting convened specifically because a school bus built in one state bore no reliable relationship to a school bus built in another. Each round of standards closed some gaps and left others untouched, because each round was written in response to the failures regulators already knew about. Fuel tank placement on activity in school buses had never before produced a fatality event at this scale. On this scale of investigation, there was no prior finding to write the rule from. That is the specific and uncomfortable lesson Carrollton left behind, and it's why the NTSB report reads less like an indictment of any single person and more like an audit of an entire regulatory category. A bus can pass every inspection a state requires and still contain a design decision that no one has yet been forced to reconsider. The reconsideration in this case came only after the worst possible demonstration of what the gap could do. In direct response to the NTSB's findings, Kentucky enacted a new school bus construction and equipment standard, among the strictest in the country at the time. The revised standard required fuel tanks to be shielded and mounted within the frame rail structure of the chassis, rather than exposed outside it. It required flame-retardant seatings and interior materials, so that seatung and enteror materials, so that a fray could not spread through a cabin at the speed the 1988 FRE had, and required far more emergency egress than a songle rear door. Add tonal exits distributed around the vehicle so that a blocked front door would never again leave 60-plus people funneling toward one 12-inch aisle. These requirements spread outward from Kentucky in modified form, adopted piece by piece in other states, and folded over the following years into the broader national conversation about school bus construction that the industry revisits at every subsequent National School Transportation Specifications and Procedures Conference. A modern school bus's multiple exits, the rear door, the driver's side emergency door many buses now carry, the roof hatches, the push-out windows spaced along both sides, are not incidental design choices. They are, in a documented and traceable way, a regulatory lineage that runs back through this specific investigation. The gasoline versus diesel question moved in the same direction. Diesel fuel, less volatile and harder to ignite than gasoline, became the standard fuel for new school bus construction in the years that followed. A shift already underway before 1988. But one that was not yet widely recognized underway before 1988, but one this crash accelerated the public and legislative conversation. None of that's changed what happened on Interstate 71 that night. What had changed was what could happen on the next bus. Bolt to a standard that no longer contained the specific gap this one had. If this channel is going to keep documenting what was in these routes and in the people who drove and rode them, subscribe. There are more buses, more routes, more drivers, and more children's geographies that were built by daily repetition, and in cases like this one, undone in a matter of minutes and rewritten permanently in the rules that followed. You have likely never thought about where the fuel tank sits on a school bus. And the reason you've never had to is that, after this night, a federal investigation made sure it sat somewhere else. And if you have a memory of a bus, a driver, a route, or simply a question about how these standards work today, put it in the comments. Do you remember how many doors your own school or church bus had, and whether anyone ever pointed out where the emergency exit was? A future video on this channel will trace the 1939 National School Bus Standards Conference, the meeting that first tried to make school buses mean the same thing in every state, decades before this crash forced the next round of that same argument. On Interstate 71, 5 miles south of Carrollton, the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet placed a highway marker, site of fatal bus crash, May 14, 1988. It is a small sign on a stretch of interstate that otherwise looks like any other. Families of the 27 who died still visit it. Some of the 34 who survived still speak publicly about that night, decades later, to school groups and safety conferences, translating what happened to them into the specific kind of testimony that keeps a regulation from ever quietly loosening again. The bus that carried them home was legal in every way that mattered on paper. The standard that replaced it was written because 27 families made sure the paper was not the last word.